According to the Constitution, the president must be a natural-born citizen, at least 35 years old, and a resident for at least 14 years. The president has a limit of 2 terms, each term being 4 years. Washington set precedent of having a 2-term limit, and the ratification of the 22nd Amendment made it official when a Republican Congress worried about FDR's multiple re-elections. The president's income is determined by Congress, and it cannot be changed while they are in office. After they leave office, they can make money by giving speeches, serving on corporate boards, and other various ways. If the president dies, resigns, or is impeached, the vice president becomes president. If the vice president dies before his inauguration, the line of succession is as follows: Speaker of the House, President pro tempore, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and other cabinet secretaries relative to the order of their creation. The 25th Amendment states that if the president is disabled, he must inform Congress, and then the vice president will become the acting president. If the president is unable to inform Congress, then the vice president and the cabinet secretaries can get Congress's approval to make the vice president the acting president. The president has to inform Congress of intent to return, but in case of any conflict, Congress decides who is president. The Constitution lists various roles of the president. The president acts as the chief legislator by proposing and vetoing legislation, and is checked by a 2/3 majority vote from each house of Congress in order to overturn a veto. He also calls Congress into special sessions. As chief executive, he enforces laws, treaties, and court decisions, as well as appointing officials and giving executive orders. He heads the Army and Navy as the commander-in-chief, but this power is checked by Congress since they appropriate funds for the military and declare war. As chief diplomat, he determines foreign policy, appoints ambassadors, negotiates treaties and executive agreements, and recognizes foreign governments. Congress checks this power by confirming appointments and appropriating funds. The role of chief jurist allows the president to appoint Supreme Court judges with the confirmation of the Senate and issue pardons to dismiss convictions. Lastly, the president serves as chief of state, as a ceremonial head, and awards medals of honor. The president also maintains roles that are not listed in the Constitution. These include his role as the head of his political party, which means he gets to choose the party's chairman for the National Committee. He also proposes the federal budget as the chief economist.
At the Constitutional Convention, different alternatives were considered. Some wanted a plural executive, a committee with several leaders. Others wanted a single head of state, with a council that had vetoing powers. Alexander Hamilton wanted an executive leader with a life term. Ultimately, the solution was one elected president with term limits. There were many common fears. With an excessively powerful president, some were worried that the president would become tyrannical, and that the system would replicate the monarchy of Britain. Others thought he would use the military to usurp the state governments, and the fact that he had no term limits worried them. On the other hand, a weak president could be controlled by the legislative branch, and he would be called a tool of the Senate. As for the selection of the president, if Congress elected the president, they would have too much power. Direct election by the people was unreliable because illiteracy and poor communication were common, and it gave large states an advantage over small states. The answer was the Electoral College. The people still had influence through state voting, and having a minimum of 3 electoral votes per state protected small states.
Under the first presidents, a rule of fitness was applied to the election process. Only the most respected men got appointed. The presidency was designed to take a back seat to Congress. That is, the legislative would be the dominant branch. However, Congress and the president often fight over who gets more power, and the presidency has periods of dominance. In the Jacksonian era, the powers of the president were increased. The use of the spoils system, or employing patrons, was common. Jackson ignored a court decision and forced Native Americans out of Georgia. The veto power increased with the establishment of the threat of the veto. Congress had to make legislation the president would agree with, or he would not pass the bill. In the post-Jacksonian era, Congress won back power. There was the occasional rise of presidential power, for example, Lincoln, who blockaded the South and issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but Congress was still the dominant branch. The president was seen as a negative force that opposed Congress, and not a source of leadership. In this time, Congress initiated legislation programs, not the president. It took strong figures such as Jackson or Teddy Roosevelt, or times of crises, for the president to become the central government figure, such as FDR during the Great Depression. The two presidencies thesis states that the president usually acquires more power during times of war and foreign crisis, and that Congress cooperates less on domestic and economic policy. The president seems to assert more control during World War II, the Cold War, the Vietnam War, etc., because Congress and the people trust him to deal with foreign issues. The relationship between the president's role of commander-in-chief and Congress's power to declare war is complicated, but usually Congress will cooperate with the president because he has more intelligence and can make more informed decisions.
There are other reasons that fuel the conflict between the president and Congress. They represent different constituencies. The president represents the whole population, while Congress members specifically represent the denizens of their states. Divided government, or having different political parties control the executive and legislative branches, forces each side to make compromises, and this limits each other's power. The system of checks and balances was designed to make cooperation between the president and Congress difficult. Even when the Democratic Party controlled both the executive and legislative branches, there were still inter-party disagreements, creating tension between them. The president also has more power through the media, as it is easier to focus on one person representing one party rather than 535 representatives with varied ideologies and party affiliations. The veto power and the threat thereof is an advantage of the president. Over 90% of all vetoed bills are unable to pass because of the difficulty getting 2/3 of each house to overturn the vetoes. So Congress must shape legislation to compromise with the president.
In the White House office, the West Wing holds the president's closest assistants. This follows the rule of propinquity. Those who stay closest to the president will have more influence over him and his decision-making. Counselors, assistants, consultants, etc. are hired and fired by the president himself without confirmation of the Senate. There are 3 types of organizational structures. The first is the pyramid model, where information trickles down from the president to other heads of staff. The second is the circular model, where information is brought to the president by staff. Ad hoc structure is for certain periods when a hybrid of both types of management is needed. The executive office is made up of agencies within that report straight to the president. The top positions of agencies are filled by presidential appointments confirmed by the Senate. Agencies include the Office of Management and Budget, the CIA, etc. The cabinet is an advisory body that shares similar views with the president and isn't established in the Constitution. It's comprised of the 15 heads of major executive agencies and is approved by the Senate. Independent agencies and commissions are not part of the cabinet, but the president still appoints officials and the Senate confirms them. If the president appoints someone and the Senate does not take action for 120 days, the appointment becomes permanent. Independent agencies include NASA and the Social Security Administration. Independent regulatory commissions are created to regulate aspects of the economy. These include the Federal Reserve and the Federal Trade Commission.
Originally, Congress was supposed to be the most dominant branch of government. However, assertive presidents such as Nixon and Johnson have expanded presidential power through non-enumerated sources and effective use of presidential power. The president can influence the public through his personality and charisma. Another source of power is the unity of the president's office. He is only one person versus the 535 people in Congress. He can also use the electronic throne, which allows him to impact the public using mass media such as addresses, sound bites, and conferences. As Commander-in-Chief, he assumes the powers discussed earlier in the video as well. If the president wins a large electoral victory, Congress usually submits to the president's plans since he has the support of the public. The executive branch has grown in power to address new issues from recent industrial and technological advancements such as pollution and labor regulations. It has the power to interpret and carry out vague legislation passed by Congress. Although these non-enumerated sources of presidential power are important, it is also vital that the president use his power effectively. Move it or lose it, presidents should take action early in their term, especially the first 100 days, when their popularity is at its peak. Avoid details. Presidents shouldn't promise too much or be too specific with their plans, so they won't be held accountable or damage their public reputation. It's best to focus on a few top priorities. Cabinets don't get much, people do. The White House staff should be given more responsibility than cabinet secretaries, since the cabinet may have split loyalties.
Since the president is granted many exclusive roles, Congress checks his power to prevent abuse. The president is granted emergency powers in times of war, which allow him to suspend habeas corpus, censor malice, declare martial law, and assume control of manufacturing and transportation facilities. However, this power is restricted by the National Emergencies Act of 1976, which states that the president must tell Congress what powers he'll use in times of emergency, and that this state of emergency will automatically end after 1 year. The president can extend it for another year without congressional authorization, though. The president is also granted war powers, which allow him to send troops without the approval of Congress. This was restricted by the War Powers Act of 1973, which stated that the president must notify Congress within 48 hours before sending troops into areas of imminent hostility and if troops will engage in combat. He can only send troops for 60 days without getting Congress's approval to extend their time abroad. Finally, Congress can pass a resolution to bring back the troops that's immune to presidential veto. Another source of increased power is the ability of the president to make executive arrangements and agreements with another head of a nation to avoid having to ratify treaties with the Senate. This helps him carry out his presidential responsibility without being obstructed by the Senate. Executive privileges grant the president the right not to divulge conversations between him and his advisors. The president can refuse to spend money appropriated by Congress, called impoundment. This power is considered borderline unconstitutional, since the president can override the budget passed by legislation. However, this is restricted by the Budget and Impoundment Act of 1974, which forces the president to ask Congress for approval not to spend certain appropriated funds. The president interprets bills and how he's going to carry them out when he signs them into law.
Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Tyler, then Polk, Taylor, Fillmore, Pierce, Buchanan, Lincoln, Johnson, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland, McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and then Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. Presidents, whom have we picked to be presidents? Let's see, throughout America's history, who's made it into the presidency?